Hi friends and welcome to another video. My name is Julie if you're new here, and today I'm going to tell you about my 5 favorite fantasy series. I think it's always so fun to get to know about people's favorites, not only to get recommendations but also to get to know them a little bit better and their taste in books, and then you can know if your tastes align or not, because a lot of the time we read books and we rate them, but that doesn't tell you that much about how you would judge them overall, even though the star system somehow does that, but not really. So knowing about people's favorites really tells you about which kinds of stories they enjoy and also what kind of themes are really important to them. And maybe it's also not that deep and you just want a good recommendation. And I'm here for that. So I will recommend you a series. That means no standalones. That is obvious, but I just wanted to make that clear. And also I'm just going to name finished series, because I could not possibly say a series is my favorite series if it's not finished. I don't know what will happen. Sometimes authors can really mess up in the end. So I'm just going to recommend series that are finished. Also, it's so nice to be able to start a series that is actually finished and you know you can read it and then you're done with it. Because I have started many fantasy series that are still ongoing and you never know. When will the next book come out? Will there be a next book? Sometimes you don't even know that. And it can also be cool to read books spaced out like that, but sometimes you need a good binge read. And the first series that I'm going to tell you about is the first series in my life that I binge read. I read the whole series over the course of a week. And I was still in school when I did that. I got these from my school library actually, back in the day. That was my favorite place. I always like to challenge myself. I still like to do that, trying to read books in a week or something like that, and that's what I did with this series. It is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and the series was actually one of the first fantasy series that I've ever read, and still to this day it is in my top 5. This series really has this cool world building and setup, because in this world where Kira, our main character, lives, people have this demon and they are connected to their demon. The demon is kind of like their soul, I would say. So if you separate a human from the demon, it's like being tortured. That is such an interesting setup. When they are young, the demon can still form itself, and then when they hit puberty, the demon has this set form. So then it will become something like an animal or something, but it's still a demon. And Lyra actually grows up in, I think it's like an orphanage set in Oxford, and she doesn't have parents anymore, so she grows up there. But then she ends up going to the north of the country, which is really cold and far away, and there are different rules and settings. So there are, for example, these huge bears that rule, as well as witches, and there people are also stealing children. And actually that happens to one of her friends called Roger, and she tries to find him or tries to help him. And there is also her uncle called Azriel, who is trying to build a bridge to a parallel world. And yeah, that all sounds really confusing and doesn't make that much sense, but if you read it, it kind of does. And what I liked about this book was that Lyra is still really young, but she has a really big impact on this world, and obviously she has some special powers that not only she has, but she has special powers. And I think when I read this was a really cool thing for me, because this is really young adult or even middle grade, and when you're young, you always think everyone else in the world has the power and everyone else is deciding for you, and taking things into your own hands is something that is really important to you. So yeah, that is something in middle grade books that I think is a very interesting topics to read at that age. But still, the whole world building and setup is so complex and interesting that even as an adult reader, it is still worth reading it. And Lyra's special power is being able to read the Golden Compass, which is also the title of the book, the first book in the trilogy. And it kind of works like a lie detector, so only a few people can actually read it and be able to tell if people are telling the truth, which can be quite handy. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting setup, and also in the next books in the series it gets even more complicated and complex, and yeah, really interesting book. And obviously the whole parallel world setup kind of has some similarities with the Chronicles of Narnia, but this book was actually written as the opposite of that. So if you're interested in this whole literary behind the scenes stuff, then go read about that. It's also really interesting if you're into that. But as I've said, this book is primarily middle grade and young adult, but it's definitely a book that can be enjoyed by all ages. It has themes that I think are also meant for more adult readers or more grown-up readers that maybe you don't really get when you're younger, and then when you're older and you reread the books, you can fully comprehend it and get the philosophical parts of the book as well. And yeah, I think that's really cool. The second series out of my 5 favorite fantasy series is actually Twilight. It's objectively not one of the 5 best fantasy series I've read, but it was one of the series that really got me into reading, and it not only sparked my love for fantasy books and paranormal stuff, but also for romance. And it was the first book that I read that combined the two things, so it really has a special place in my heart because of that. And I was so obsessed with these books back in the day when I read them for the first time. I read the first book for 10 times at least, and I also binge watched the films. They are still some of my comfort films that I will watch when I'm not feeling well. Yeah, it just transports me back into an easier time in life where the only thing you would worry about was school and if your crush would notice you or not. So these books really are my feel-good books, and we all need that in our lives sometimes, right? The next series is one that I just discovered more recently. Out of all the series on this list, it was the last one that I discovered. It is the Grisha series by Lee Bardugo, and with the Grisha series I include the Six of Crows duology and also King of Stars duology, because that is just one big universe that just belongs together for me, and I couldn't say which of those I like the best because they just all belong together. And I didn't read these books when they first came out. I think they are pretty old. The first book was already published in 2012, which would have been also around the time where I finished school, but I just read them a few years ago. Actually, I think 3 years ago I started the series and I just finished it this year. So it definitely still holds up very well. There was also a huge hype because the series for that came out on Netflix, and that sparked interest in the original series again. And I think it's awesome. It's a great world building, and especially the first series has everything that you would expect from a fantasy series. There is someone who discovers her powers. There's this whole training sequence where they learn how to use their powers. Then there's a huge fight scene. There are enemies and there's betrayal and lots of plot twists, and just everything that you could really wish for. Oh, and there are also quests that the hero has to master, and yeah, just everything. But then we also have Six of Crows, which is more of a heist story set in the same universe. And that was mind-blowing for me when I read that. It has some of the best characters, and it's just so filled with excitement and tension, and you're rooting for the characters so much. And then we have the ending duology, King of Skulls and Rule of Wolves, which is more about really concluding the series, spending time with the characters that you have gotten to know before, and like solving all of the stuff that has been left over from the series before, and going a little bit deeper into some political stuff. And also it has like this satisfying ending for all of it. So yeah, I would definitely say that is worth a read. Next up we have a series that is not well known, and I think that's a shame because I love it so much. It is a German series, so that's why not many people know about it, I believe, but it has been translated to English because it's really good. It is called Arcadia Awakens by Kai Meier. And the coolest thing about this is that this is like a mafia fantasy. It's so good. It is about Rosa, and Rosa is going from New York, moving to Sicily to be there with her family and spend time with her sister, who also lives there. She actually goes there because of a family tragedy that has happened, and her sister and her aunt live in this ancestral home, and she also moves in there. And as soon as she arrives, she actually falls for this guy. He's called Alessandro, and he is the heir of a mafia family. And their families are actually sworn enemies, so they should not be spending any time with each other. And her sister and her aunt are really against her meeting him and being with him because they think he's just using her to know more about their clan. But when Rosa arrives, she discovers more and more family secrets and weird stuff that is happening, magical stuff that is happening, especially when one night Rosa meets a tiger on her land, and that tiger has eyes that are very familiar to her. She doesn't really know what's going on, and she doesn't know who she can trust anymore, if she can trust the people in her family or the people around her family, or if she can trust Alessandro. And yeah, it's just all really cool. I think this is one of the best paranormal fantasies that I've ever read, and it's definitely young adult if you enjoy that. But the setting is so beautiful in Sicily, and then just this mafia thing on top of that. It's so good. Also, if you're into mythology in your fantasy books, then check this out. It's so cool. And the last fantasy series that I want to recommend to you is Bartimaeus by Jonathan Stroud. This is also one of my favorite fantasy series because the world building is awesome. It is an urban fantasy. So we have Nate, who is a young magician. He's just learning how to use magic, really. And he lives in London, where there are a lot of wizards living there, and also the whole government is made up out of wizards. And then there are also people who don't use magic or can't use magic, really, just like the normal folks. And Nathaniel actually had to leave his family to be able to train for becoming a magician, and he now lives with this older magician who is training him. He's called Arthur Underwood, and he is like in the ministry, but he's not one of the powerful guys. He's just a random dude, and he's not the most loving person to grow up with. So Nate really wants to learn more, also because a different magician called Simon Lovelace humiliates him. He wants to take things into his own hands, decides one day that he wants to call a djinn, who is called Bartimaeus, to steal something from Loveless. And Bartimaeus actually is 5,000 years old and pretty smart and powerful. He would definitely say that himself, at least. And Nate maybe was a little bit arrogant when he thought it would be a good idea and that he could control everything that happens in the future. But now Bartimaeus is there and he has the job to steal this amulet. And that's also what the first book is called, The Amulet of Samarkand. And I tell you, these books are so funny. These are the funniest fantasy books that I have ever read. I don't know of any other fantasy books that deal with comedy in a way that this book does. It's just amazing. I was laughing out loud a lot of times when I was reading these, and especially Bartimaeus has a really funny sense of humor. It's just so good. And the author works a lot with footnotes, which was also really unique, and I have never seen that done in any other book. It's awesome. Just so good. And in this series there are 3 books, it's a trilogy, and there is a 4th book, but that doesn't really tell the main story that is going on. It is more like an add-on, which tells Bartimaeus' story before all of that happened. So it's not really relevant to the plot. If you want to read it, you can also just read the 3 books. So yeah, these were my 5 favorite fantasy books. If you have read any of them, please let me know in the comments what you think. And if you happen to read any of them after I recommend them to you, please reach out to me. I would love to hear your thoughts on them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!